Hi everybody. In this VR render video, I'm going to take a look at the creation of this scene using Twinmotion 2024 and using Lumen. I'll run through the scene settings, the lighting and environment settings, and hopefully give you some tips on working with Lumen and the creation of architectural rendering video clips. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. Okay everybody. So here we are in Twinmotion 24.1.2, which is the most recent version that's considered stable. First thing we need to do is just turn off the auto exposure. Auto exposure will be under the camera tab here, and just turn that off. And then we can maybe just put the exposure back to 0 and then just dial it back manually. So we get a result that we kind of like. Because we're doing an exterior only, we don't have to worry about flipping between interior and exterior shots, so we should be able to keep a relatively stable exposure. Negative 4.5 should work just fine. The next step will be to establish our large materials. So these will be often the landscape materials, not just the grass, but maybe any ground materials. And because we envision this project being sort of built into kind of like the side of a raised area, we do need to just really fill in our base material for this section right here that's currently in teal. I'm going to assign some large materials to the largest areas. We'll also establish materials for the landscape. Once we're done with that, we'll start building our foliage. Now you can see that we've got our larger materials established. We are using quite a lot of Megascans materials, and because this house is, well, beautifully designed, has a relatively minimal amount of actual materials involved in the construction. We have established what our overall biome is going to be. So we're using this mossy rock ground plane. And you can see we're going to build up the environment back here, kind of have rocks and maybe some scrub just sort of hanging on the edge of this, sort of where the landscape kind of is carved away for the home to be built. We've also used a couple of decorative brick materials here, and we have ensured that parallax or the height maps are turned on. For the overall metal, we're using one of the standard Twinmotion metal materials, and we again just make sure that everything is set up correctly. We've got an exterior concrete area, and we've got some areas of soil mulch, which will be our flower beds or decorative elements. Now, the wood material is quite interesting. This is just the standard wood material that came with the SketchUp model. However, we have copied and pasted into the normal map. We've pasted in just a copy of the default albedo or diffuse texture map. And we've also done the same for the height map. Now, this is not, strictly speaking, PBR accurate. By all accounts, the height and normal map should actually be separately generated. You shouldn't really just drag them in, but if you're in a pinch and you can't get anything else that works, you can at least do that. Now, it's not perfect, and you can see it's converted the height map to a sort of grayscale map, but the intensity is all wrong, so you got to keep it super, super low. But with the camera maybe back here, it won't be as big a deal. Okay, let's move on and start building up the actual biome. Please note, we have also turned Lumen on, so we're actually working now with our Lumen in the viewport so we can see how the scene is going to look. Continuing the theme of working large to small, you can see that we have placed a lot of the Megascans nature rock mossy assets. And we're using these to sort of help and break up our landscape environment. They're also kind of lightweight. I believe, as far as memory serves, the largest texture size for these is about 2K. So you can actually populate your scene with a lot of this really gorgeous rocky kind of tundra environment, which is sort of the feel that we're going for. Not quite a sort of Norwegian and not quite a Canadian kind of environment here, but something that uses a very rugged look. Maybe not quite North American either, but somewhere sort of in between there. And we'll be adding some really nice piney woods to this as well, just to give that kind of remote feeling. But you can see we're also using these rocks just to break up the sameness of the actual environment, and they're working quite well with the landscape that we sculpted in SketchUp. One of the really great features of these is the way that they snap quite well. So if I go and let's just say we download this tundra rocky ground right here, and with that downloaded, as we drag it out and place, it'll do a really good job of snapping to the underlying geometry. It's a lovely way to just build up your scene relatively quickly using very high quality environment assets. Our house just needs to be decorated. So let's go ahead and start adding again some trees, and then we'll get in and do our foliage on the home. Okay, the next thing we want to look at, and I will talk about the trees in a second, is grass, adding grass. And you can see here, we have got the library, Megascans, 3D plants, grass, and wild. Because we're going for that tundra-y look, we don't want to just fill this with like lawn grass or manicured grass. That would look kind of inconsistent with the look we're going for. Now, it used to be that you could not use the painted vegetation, if you will, the scatter brush. So that's going to be under populate, place, paint, this guy right here. And it used to be that you could not use that with the Megascans objects. Now you can, which is really, really fantastic. And this allows you to build up grasses using, in many ways, slightly better looking models than what you normally get. So we've got a couple of different things in here. We've got quite a lot you can see going on in this. All these tundra grasses. So how it seems to work is when you have your painted vegetation ready to go, you can click download, for example, the tundra grass and just drag it directly into here. Now, I do recommend going in and deleting. I can't, to the best of my knowledge, figure out a way to get this to just download singular objects. So it does seem like you have to drag these out and then manually delete them. So maybe somebody knows a better way about doing this. But I'm going to delete some of these variations. We still have to be very mindful, even though we're going to be painting this and even though we're using Lumen, we want to keep our overheads a little bit low. So I'm going to stick to just a handful of different grasses here. I don't want thousands of variations, maybe bogging down the system. And I'm just working on a tiny little patch right here off the camera. And this will allow me to effectively kind of figure out the look and feel of my grass before I start painting it elsewhere. Now, I do still want a little bit of standard grass in there. So we'll go vegetation, and we're going to look at not detailed grasses, but grass and flowers. And I do want something in here that will take up a little bit more space. So we'll take a look at maybe the long grass or one of these wild grasses and see what looks good. Now, the other thing to note is the actual placement of trees. Now, you could go in here and place this manually, but again, just use these painted tools. If you're worried about performance, hit Control-P, go quality, and you can drop everything all the way down. Now, medium obviously doesn't look great, but definitely comes with a massive performance improvement. You can see by just dropping my stats from 29% there, and if we go back here, for example, to high, my performance is going to drop a little bit. So I'm utilizing about 10% more of my system resources just by putting that from medium to high. We are using a beautiful mix of, again, these are some of the newer trees. So these are ones that you will have to actually download. So these will be under vegetation and trees all the way down the bottom. These do not come pre-installed by default, but they are available to you. They'll have the little download icon, so just download them. I've got Ponderosa pine, Monterey pine, Austrian pine, and I did add in a little dash of the Japanese maple. You do get maple trees growing in certain areas along with pine trees. They're not entirely mutually exclusive. But I still want most of my trees to be pine. And I have painted this, I should say, all around our actual environment. And all in all, things are running pretty nicely. Now I'm going back to my grass. What I'm going to do is select this, and I'm pretty happy with the overall look. It's time to grab my paintbrush and really just start kind of putting this kind of all over. Now, we don't necessarily want to decorate every element, but you can see as I just left-clicked and slowly dab this in, I'm just building up some of the wildness, that feeling of sort of like plants and grasses that are just kind of eking out an existence in and around the rocks and the scrubland. We've also added our decorative green foliage elements. Now, I wanted this area right in front of the home to be the hero part, at least from the outside point of view. So we've added quite a number of bushes, European spindle set, which is one you can download, and also some of the more default bushes as well. I've added a huge amount of ground cover clover, and you can find these just by searching for clover. I do recommend that you, once you bring them in, that you rearrange the positioning of them. They tend to come in kind of spread out. I'd bring them in a little bit closer together, and then you can move and duplicate. Just by holding down the shift, you can drag out a cluster, click instance if you want it to be the exact same thing. I also recommend just coming in here and dropping the clover into the ground. Look how high that is. It's practically sitting like about a half a foot up, which is not really realistic for clover at all, especially ground cover clover. So drop that little fella down a little bit and it'll look a lot more realistic. We've added in some more variations as well, just to give this a more lived-in feel and just to give the impression that this really is a sort of intentionally designed area right outside the front of the home. And this will go sort of complement nicely the rocks that we've added, as if to give the impression that these were construction rocks that were moved and then placed as a decorative element. Now, in terms of lighting, we've added a mixed bag on the inside. We're not doing an interior shot, we're just doing the outside. So what we actually have in terms of lights is a mixed setup of an omnidirectional and an area light. And both of these will work together to blast light outside. So really looks like there's lights on in the building, and because it's an overcast render, you're seeing some of that light come through. Now, the settings for these are pretty basic. For example, the omnidirectional light, it's at a 3500 lumen. It has got, move myself out of the way, shadows enabled, so hopefully that'll stop light leaking through. You can see it is a little bit up here, which I don't really love. And then the attenuation is really just sort of how far do you want this light to actually travel. Now, in an ideal world, I'd probably get this to where I'm not getting any light leaks, but, you know, just in terms of time management, that's good enough right there. Same with another set that we have over here. A very similar situation. Got an area light, again, shadows enabled. Cut the attenuation a little bit. You don't want the light here going like 1,000 miles off, so keep it, you know, within 10, 15, 20, 30 feet. Shadows are on, nice warm color, and then just crank the intensity to whatever you think works best for your scene. Now, the other thing to note is the overall ambient environment light. Now, by the way, I am working here right now with Lumen. I'll talk about in the next section really quickly just about the sky that we're going to use and just go through the actual settings for the Lumen render. Please note one thing, in my experience, Lumen is really easy, I think, to get working for exteriors. So far, I've found it to be a bit of a nightmare while working with interior shots. Hopefully in a follow-up video, we'll talk about Lumen for interiors. But just for a Lumen exterior shot, this looks pretty nice. And so if we had set up a camera and we're animating, you can see it should work pretty nicely. Now that we've got our environment pretty much set up, let's set up our camera and we'll set up a bunch of different images so we can try different lighting environments. So this is what we currently have. So I'm on image 1. So first thing I want to do is go to the environment tab. I'll scroll up to the top here and I just want to run through some of the settings really quickly. I want to make sure that we are on Lumen. We are. And I'm going to crank the scene detail to 4. Please note that you can type in other values for this. I believe up to 150, but I'm going to leave it at just 10. I'm going to make sure the view distance is all the way. In other words, I want Lumen, as it's working in the viewport, to go further than the default setting. So to ensure that everything I see is basically being affected by the Lumen process, I'm going to update the lighting update speed. Not going to make a huge difference here, but I have turned off my webcam just to increase performance as well. I'm going to do Control P and then go to Quality. Make sure everything is set to Ultra, and I think that looks pretty nice. So this is kind of as good as our viewport can get right now. Now, on top of that, the Lumen reflection settings, I'm going to leave these on optimized until I'm pretty much ready to render. I'm going to take the shadow bias down as well, and just moving the shadow slider. You can see we're not getting a huge distance here, so I'm going to leave it at, probably just put this at like 100 feet. There we go. That should cover everything. All right, let's look at the ambient settings as well. A couple of things to note. Firstly, we are using a HDRI. This is Lenong 1, and I have it set to an intensity of 50. You can see if we crank it all the way up to 100, you lose a little bit of kind of the sky fidelity. So right now, about 50 seems to be working okay. I have the sky rotated, so I'm not seeing any potential. You can see the trees moving in the background. I just repositioned this sky, and then I'm just going to update my image. Just hit the little update button. There we go. Okay, under the other environment settings, for natural lighting, the sun intensity is just set to 1. You could increase this, but honestly, it's not going to make a huge difference. I don't want to add extra light into this. I want the light to come entirely just from the HDRI. Sun size and reflection don't really matter for this, and ambient. Now, because we're going for kind of a dramatic look, we will kind of take the ambience up to about 2. So we're adding basically, just think of it as lightening up everything in the scene. Now, for the weather slider, I do kind of like when there's a little bit of rain or puddles in our scene. I don't necessarily want rain falling down, but sometimes just the after look of rain is actually quite nice. In other words, we get some really, really nice reflections from the precipitation slider. A couple of other things that we want to do on this. I want to make sure the wetness slider, you can kind of see as I move this, I can increase or decrease. I'll put this back to about 0.5. I'm going to increase the puddle size. I kind of want to make it look like it just rained a little bit. And then on the actual rain, I just want to make sure that I'm not getting sort of rain falling in the shot. I don't necessarily want that. So there we go. We've got our rain slider set up. And if we go back here, how does that look? I think it looks pretty nice. So let's, again, just update that. Okay, looking good. Height fog. I'm going to add a bit of fog here. You can see I don't want it to be so occluded that we're not actually seeing really the build. Oh, that is, I'm not disliking that, but it's not necessarily what we want for this. I'm going to bring the height fog back, and I really just wanted to give a little dash of haze off in the distance. So I'm going to bring it up to about 35%. Pretty happy with that overall. Wind speed is fine. Everything else seems to be working just fine. Okay, the camera settings. The overall exposure, let's take a look at this. I want to do a couple of things here. We're going to take off auto exposure. Ooh, and you can see how bright that actually gets. So I'm going to bring this back. I want to control the exposure, and it's generally recommended that you, as a user, I think really do this. I'm going to put this to -1. Yeah, I'm actually pretty happy with that. About 2 seems to work fine. Okay. White balance, you can see it's at 6,500. I don't necessarily want to add any warmth to this, and I don't want to go any colder in the image. I do think 6,500 Kelvin is actually pretty nice for what we want. Anytime you change a setting in Twinmotion, just right-click to deselect. Okay, local exposure, yes, this is something we do want to tweak. And you can see I want to kind of clamp down on some of the highlights. I don't want them overexposed, so I'm going to move that to the right. And then the shadows, I don't want to lighten my shadows. I actually want to bring the shadows back down. So we've increased the ambient, but sort of, if you will, darken the shadows in between objects. So I think that looks pretty nice. Now I'm getting a slight hot spot on the left side of the roof. So let's fix that. Now, focal length, I'm pretty happy with putting the focal length to 18. I think this works pretty nicely. I'm not too pushed about using any of the film backs. We could do these for alternative shots. Absolutely, we could go in here and mess around with these. But overall, I'm pretty happy with just the default camera and the default focal length. Pretty happy with that. We do want to make sure parallelism is turned on. You can see it straightens the shot a little bit. We don't need near clipping, and I'm not using chromatic aberration. Vignetting is left at 40, and sharpness, I do want to kind of crank this up a little bit. I've likened 50% to kind of what you get with D5, but I want something a little less than that. So I'm going to maybe just try 25, seems like a good compromise. Now, we're going to go to the FX lastly, and I'm going to take the contrast up. I think it's up to about 60. And the saturation, if I crank saturation, you kind of see how this actually affects the image. So I'm going to take this down. I don't want it to be super saturated. In fact, I kind of want to pull away some of that nice saturation and just going to make this look a little bit more realistic. All right, I am pretty happy with that at the moment, so I'm going to hit refresh. And I'm going to duplicate this image by going to image 1, hover on the 3 dots, and go duplicate. Now, I'm going to duplicate this kind of a bunch of times really. And each of these duplicates is going to keep the same camera angle, but I'm going to try different skies. All right, let's take a look at those in a moment. Now, we've already talked about image 1, overcast, so I'm going to look at image 2. And this, I wanted a foggy, hazy atmosphere. A couple of things about this you can see here. We go to the right, we're using a different HRI. This is Kloppenheim number 7, which is very, very nice gray ambient, but does come with a white hotspot, which is very, very nice. The main thing here is really just going to be a case of adding a huge amount of fog to the scene. So I've taken this up quite high here, and I think overall I'm pretty happy. It's a nice blend of ambient and this nice foggy, hazy atmosphere, but everything is still readily visible. Image 3, Dawn, slightly different one. Unlike the others here, I've dropped the intensity quite a bit. We're using Bell Park Dawn HDRI. Again, I've dropped this intensity quite substantially. We still have a little bit of fog going on as well. And other than that, though, I think the image just looks pretty nice. It does hopefully elicit an early morning feel. In terms of some other changes, the white balance has been adjusted a little bit. You can see we've actually brought in a bit more warmth into this image. We're kind of going away from the blues which you'd get in those overcast skies. And we're starting to add just a little bit more orange in terms of the white balance back into this. And we could probably take this up to maybe 9,000 Kelvin. Local exposure has stayed pretty much the same. In this case, though, we've made a little bit of an adjustment to the shadows here. Again, just giving some nice, dark, dramatic shadows. Overall, I do quite like this one. Image number 4 is probably going to be the most divisive one on this. I wanted a render that showed sort of dappled light. It's slightly indirect lighting where I don't want the sun just blasting onto the building. But it's very difficult to get this look with the HDRIs or the HDRI environments or just even the skies. So we have to actually turn that off. In order to get this look, what we need to do is go down here, turn off the HDRI lighting environment, just forget about it entirely. We're going to use the traditional sort of natural lighting setup. So I've dropped the sun intensity to about 16,000, which is probably, I think, by looks values, I think probably lower than reality would have. It's not, I think, you know, it's very low level of sun. The sun size and sun reflection, if I'm not mistaken, they do affect Lumen, but I'm not hugely pushed about this. I've taken the sun size up and the sun reflection up. Maybe somebody who knows a bit more about the lighting system in Twinmotion could kind of tell you the effect those will have. Ambience I did drop as well from, we had it set to 2 before. I've taken this back down to a little bit lower. So this one was set at 1. And then the main thing here was to actually get the sun coming in at the right angle. So I'm going to turn these off and we're going to go down to location. And this is where I really just have to rotate this and get the look that we're going for. You can see it's pretty bright with the sun coming in, even at that, you know, 16 to 17,000 kind of lux measurement. And so what I settled on was something about like this. And then we did go back to the camera and again, just adjust the exposure manually. I really like this look. I know some people don't. The idea of like indirect and especially shadows falling across the building, I think that's just, some people will like that look and some people won't. I do, but again, it's your render ultimately at the end of the day. I just like that dappled feeling of light coming through the clouds and or coming through the tree, and I like that some of the vegetation is heavily occluded, but you also still get a lot of the detail. Now, the last one, I wanted to do kind of a nighttime render for a long time, and generally my recommendation to people is don't. They're actually quite challenging because realistically at night, unless you're out in the middle of nowhere and there's no lights around, in an urban environment, you're going to get bounce ambient lighting just coming from lots of different areas. In other words, nighttime renders are actually brighter than people realize. And so what I did settle on here for this one is basically we're going to use a HRN, which is Kloppenheim 04. We have dropped the actual exposure quite a bit. And you can see it's not quite super dark. It's very dark, but it's, there's the lighting going on here. And what I'm going to need to do is manually add in extra lights to overall lighten the building itself. I'll hopefully show the end results of this at the end of the video. But nighttime renders, if you can get away with not having to do them, great. They're very, very challenging, and I don't recommend them personally. Next thing we're going to do is take a look at setting up some video clips using our image number 1 overcast. For the first shot, we're going to stick with very basic camera movements. I generally suggest to people recommending not to do really dramatic shots. There's I would say there might be a time and a place for those. But if you're doing like homes, which is kind of mostly all I really do, I don't recommend doing these like dramatic swooping shots that, they tend to be kind of like hard for viewers to deal with. So keep the shot movements basic. Simple dolly shots back and forth, or pans to the left and right, or focal changes do work really well. But you want to avoid doing like Avengers style, like flying camera shots. Here we are. We've got our first clip here. And I'm just going to literally just move the camera forward a little bit, and then I'm going to hit the plus. Okay, this is going to take place over 10 seconds. Hit play to see. And there we go. Just a simple shot that focuses in on the build. By the way, you might be wondering why there's a bollard here. I just put that in so I could see the shadows in when I was doing the earlier video. There you go. 10 seconds, a little bit long for kind of something like this. If we put this down to 8, bearing in mind what we want to do is string together a bunch of these clips together. So about 8 seconds, I think that's enough. Going beyond 10, you might start to lose a little bit of audience interest. In other words, people might find the video just kind of a bit long. So that's going to be our video number 1. All right, everybody. So these are the 4 shots that we've set up for this. So video 1, we'll just hit play, and you can see pretty straightforward. Just sort of I think it's a dolly shot moving forward. Video 2 is going to be just a simple kind of pan and just a slight change in perspective. So just going from left to right. And then video 3, I'm just kind of focusing in on the metallic car material and just slightly moving the camera upwards, and a change of depth of field just to put the car out of focus. And then the last one is going to be a bit more of an artistic shot where we've got very extreme depth of field, some nice little butterfly models just kind of floating around, and then just slowly moving upwards towards the actual home. Now, one thing I will mention, I do strongly recommend for videos, as it currently stands, rendering out in 4K, and ideally doing 60 frames per second if you can. Just a lot smoother, just really is going to make your videos just look a little bit better. And with that being said, we are done. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.